Hello, Bible readers. Today we take on 1816 through 1938. And I say take on because the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah they presented the editors of Genesis with a problem. So of course it's going to be a challenge for us who read it now as well. This is one of those sections that includes three pieces, but no one of them is going to make sense without being read with the other pieces. Here's the problem at hand. Whoever the editor of Genesis was, or editors. And when I say that, I mean that at some point, much like a group of church leaders once sat down with hundreds of letters and gospels and lots of other writings, and they had to make decisions about which ones would become part of the New Testament, that kind of process likely happened with the stories that become Genesis. Scholars try to identify stories as coming from the priestly tradition. They label those stories as P for priestly. Then there are the Yahwist stories, which starts with J, so those are the J stories. There's D stories, maybe many more traditions that are represented with all the different stories that are included in Genesis. When that editing process happened, there obviously had to be some stories that were so well known in Israel that they just had to be included. Like, there are some American stories that they'd have to be a part of our history. And if you had to share our history in a concise way, like the Civil War, for example, that's gonna be a part of any American story that we would tell. It can't be left out. But the question becomes, how do you tell it? What commentary would you as an editor maybe offer about the story that you must include? Maybe none. Maybe you just let the story speak for itself and it doesn't need commentary. Or maybe you'd emphasize certain points to highlight an agenda that you have. Or you could do like the editors of Genesis have done in our texts for today. What they did to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah that they just had to include, which is chapter 19, verses 1 to 29, which is the old story, what they do is, before telling that doozy, they first offer a preemptive critique of of the familiar thing you're about to hear. It would be familiar, for like when Genesis first came out. Israelites would have been like, oh yeah, we know this one. Well, before you hear this one that you just know, they add something. Chapter 18, verses 16 to 32, when Abraham is negotiating with the Lord, their conversation, Abraham and the Lord's, about a new kind of righteousness, is meant to be a first word that overrides the values and priorities described, or at least paint a different color onto the values and priorities described in the bad old story that is Sodom and Gomorrah. Chapter 19, verses 30 to 38, that's the third piece of our segment today, but it's not related really to the main point that I'm going to be getting at. It's just really about the origin of two tribes that had been designated as bastards, but are treated as members of the family of promise anyway. So it's another good example of our inclusive God at work. But back to this bad old story and its preemptive critique. Brueggemann says that the theological claim of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah's destruction is simple and familiar. Humanity has been disobedient to God, and so humanity must be destroyed. It's a lot like the indictment judgment structure that we see in the flood narrative. This presents a view of moral reality that is widely shared in popular religion. What's easy about this old story is that God is mechanical. It's the kind of God we would expect, right? We do this, God responds like that. That's just how things must happen. God punishing sinners for what they deserve to be punished for doesn't take much imagination, right? Most wisdom teaching in the ancient world and in our own world is uncomplicated like this. Retribution theology is the ground for bloodthirsty revenge in every society. But none of this is in keeping with grace, or a God of promise, or a God of surprise that we've been reading about throughout Genesis. If read alone, chapter 19 lends itself toward a scare theology of moralism, which is most certainly not the gospel that Christians proclaim. So that Sodom and Gomorrah story has to be read with chapter 18, 16 to 32. The claim in 18, 16 to 32 is that there is an alternative way of being in the world. The standard way of being is, you did wrong, therefore you deserve punishment. That's the old understanding of righteousness. Obey and be righteous, or disobey, and the only way to become righteous is that you must be punished. Retribution brings about righteousness. At the heart of that understanding is that innocence is not as powerful as guilt. This is a really interesting idea. We say something like this to kids all the time, right? The bad actions of a few can ruin everything for everyone. A few guilty people in Sodom and Gomorrah could ruin the party for the whole city. Can the inverse be true? Can just a few innocent people make everything okay for everyone when most everyone else is evil? That's Abraham's gospel question, the question that creates the foundations for Christians to say goodness is stronger than evil, life is greater than death. Brueggemann says that Abraham's argument is that simply bad old retribution theology, just killing everyone in punishment for evil, that's unworthy of God's holiness, God's otherness. Abraham's argument, he says, is not based on what is morally attractive, but is based on the character of God's holiness. So there's an innovation that's happening here in this text. In the flood narrative, the innovation was about the pain in the heart of God. Like that was a new idea. Here, the innovation concerns God valuing the righteous, the innocent, more than craving the destruction of the unrighteous, the guilty. Must God mechanically punish the wicked? The answer is clearly no. God gets to be God. And Abraham argues with God that God's holiness moves God to love the righteous more than he hates the unrighteous. This is a big, giant deal that forms the foundations of Christian theology. What is at issue here is the character of God. Brueggemann says, God is gracious, not because of the claims of the guilty, because there's no excusing their guilt, but God is gracious for the sake of his own reputation. Thus, hope for humanity comes to be rooted not in us excusing ourselves, but in God's defense of God's own character. Paul in the New Testament is going to use this very text in Genesis 18 to proclaim that God has broken the death grip of the bad old retribution system, where the only response to our unrighteousness has to be punishment, has to be death. The capacity to break that bad old system is the substance of God's holiness. God is able, God is ready to break the systems that imprison us and lead us to small lives only on their way to death. Barrenness can be broken by God's promises. Retribution can be broken by a new righteousness. The new righteousness that God models in Genesis 18 as a critique of what we then read in Genesis 19 is most familiar to us from the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus will say that the disciples are called to love their enemies. Love your enemies is the new righteousness. God starts that back in Genesis 18 when Abraham calls upon God's holiness rather than God's need for revenge, which is just too easy and petty for God. The thing about this whole text, many people live in fear of God, assuming that God has no other agenda than to keep the old righteousness system alive. We have a different claim as Christians, that God actively seeks a way out of death for all of us and eventually does. But that's a story for another day. There's a lot more to say, but let's aim it tomorrow when we're going to look at chapter 20 and chapter 21. It will be a birthday. I am one with my God. My God is with us, all of us, at all times and in all places.